On August 19, 1944, at the Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia, General Alfred Jodl sat over the latest intelligence reports. The Western Front, once an impenetrable fortress, was crumbling under the force of the Allied advance. The Americans, particularly General George S. Patton's Third Army, had pushed forward with such speed that their logistical lines, stretched over 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, were beginning to fray at the seams. To any seasoned military strategist, it was an unsustainable pace. Jodl, with his calculated understanding of warfare, knew that no army, regardless of its might, could sustain such a rapid advance without the essential supplies. Fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts. These were the lifeblood of any army, and the Americans were running dangerously low. The Germans had witnessed it before, during their campaigns in Russia. No matter how fast their forces advanced, the same problem inevitably arose. Logistics would fail. German generals, familiar with the harsh realities of mechanized warfare, had long understood this principle. Jodl's staff had already calculated the figures. Patton's forces had outrun their supply lines, and it was only a matter of time before the Third Army would come to a grinding halt. In just a few days, maybe hours, the Americans would be immobilized. The German army would have time to regroup and mount a counterattack. They might even be able to hold the line at the Seine River, perhaps even into the winter. The belief in the inevitability of Patton's collapse was so entrenched that it seemed like a matter of fact. However, what Jodl and his officers couldn't have anticipated was that, 125 miles away, a fleet of nearly 6,000 trucks was already on the move. These trucks, brimming with essential supplies, were rolling eastward in an endless convoy, headlights blazing through the night. The operation, soon to be known as the Red Ball Express, was so audacious that even the Germans, masters of mechanized warfare, would never have conceived it. The plan was simple in its scope, but complex in its execution. An unrelenting, continuous supply line would feed Patton's forces, keeping them moving at the pace they had set. In the coming days, Jodl's carefully calculated predictions of Patton's imminent halt would be proven utterly wrong. The Third Army, starved of resources, would surge forward once again, defying the laws of warfare that Jodl and his officers had lived by. It was a defiance of military doctrine and a testament to the ingenuity of those who had organized it. The scale of the operation was staggering. The 6,000 trucks would deliver 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours, creating a logistical flow that defied all expectations. In a matter of days, Patton's tanks, once thought immobilized, would be crashing through German defenses at the Seine, breaking through the German lines with a ferocity that few had thought possible. The Germans would soon learn that their understanding of warfare, built on the notion that logistics were the weak link in any army, had been fatally flawed. They had underestimated the Americans, not only in their tactical ability, but in their industrial might and ability to adapt to the most challenging conditions. The men behind the Red Ball Express were not the polished officers and strategists who would typically command such an operation. They were mostly African-American truck drivers, many of whom were part of a segregated force, who were tasked with keeping the supply lines open. They would soon prove that it was not just military doctrine that won wars. It was the ability to get the right supplies to the right place at the right time. These men, operating under conditions of exhaustion, frustration, and constant danger, would become the unsung heroes of the campaign, their efforts shaping the outcome of the war in ways that would reverberate for years to come. While the Germans were still calculating how the Americans could possibly maintain their advance, the Red Ball Express was already shattering every assumption they had made about the limits of logistics and supply. For Jodl and his officers, the impending defeat was something they could not have foreseen, and it all began with those trucks rolling eastward, against the odds, against the expectations, and against the very nature of modern warfare. In the summer of 1944, the Allies were making significant headway in their push across Western Europe. The successful D-Day landings in Normandy had been followed by rapid advances toward the heart of France. General George S. Patton's Third Army, renowned for its speed and aggressive tactics, was leading the charge. However, This remarkable advance came with a critical problem that threatened to stall everything: logistics. Patton's forces had outrun their supply lines. The roads, once capable of handling the vast movements of armored columns and heavy trucks, were now torn apart by constant movement and German sabotage. Bombed-out bridges, destroyed railways, and impassable stretches of roads made resupply an ever-increasing challenge. The farther they advanced, the more isolated they became from the vital resources needed to keep their momentum. Tanks, trucks, and artillery units were running low on fuel, and the front lines were increasingly without ammunition. The situation grew more dire by the day. As Patton's forces pressed deeper into France, they encountered not just physical destruction but logistical chaos. The system that had worked so efficiently during the earlier stages of the war could no longer keep up. The enemy, fully aware of the importance of logistics in modern warfare, was also adapting to this new situation. German forces, although retreating, knew the Americans couldn't maintain their rapid advance without a robust supply chain. They were doing everything they could to slow down the Americans' forward progress, including continuous attacks on supply lines, ambushes of convoys, and cutting off the few remaining roads that were still navigable. By the middle of August, General Patton, typically known for his bold and aggressive tactics, was faced with a new kind of battle, one that wasn't fought on the front lines but in the rear. His Third Army, known for moving faster than any force in history, had reached a critical juncture. If the logistical problems weren't addressed immediately, his army would come to a standstill. And once that happened, the Germans would have the time they needed to regroup, reorganize, and counterattack. The race against time had begun. For General Patton, the situation was intolerable. He understood the importance of supply lines, and the realization that they were the bottleneck to his army's success was devastating. If the flow of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts stopped, so would the momentum of the Third Army. Patton was known for his audacity, but even he had no answers for this logistical crisis. He needed someone who could think beyond traditional methods, someone who could innovate a solution that would allow his army to continue its advance without being held back by the enemy or the destruction of infrastructure. In the heart of this crisis was General Alexander Orloff, the chief logistics officer of the Third Army. Orloff had been tasked with ensuring that supplies reached Patton's advancing forces, but he was quickly realizing that traditional methods of supply, like scheduled convoys and use of rail transport, simply weren't working anymore. The roads were no longer reliable, and the pace at which his army was moving made it impossible to use any conventional means to keep up with the demand for resources. Orloff had spent countless hours in his command tent, studying maps, debating with his fellow officers, and trying to find a solution to the impossible logistical nightmare that was unfolding before him. He came to a painful conclusion. The Third Army could not continue at its current speed without an entirely new strategy. Conventional methods were not enough. What they needed was a solution that was as fast and relentless as the army it was designed to supply, a system that could keep pace with the rapid advances on the battlefield. Orlov knew what that solution had to be. They needed a continuous, unbroken supply line, one that would operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, without interruption. However, the sheer scale of this idea seemed insurmountable. The roads were still under constant threat from German forces, and despite the best efforts of the engineers, many of the vital routes were destroyed or blocked. Moving thousands of trucks day and night through a war-torn country was an idea that defied every traditional rule of warfare. The logistics officers, trained to rely on predictable supply routes and scheduled deliveries, couldn't fathom how such a system could be implemented. But Orloff, staring at the maps in front of him, understood that the only way to keep Patton's forces moving forward was to break every conventional rule of supply chain management. They would have to create a new kind of system, one that prioritized speed, redundancy, and absolute priority, regardless of the risks. The plan would need to bypass the conventional centralized supply depots and instead create a more dynamic, decentralized system that could deliver supplies directly to where they were most needed, often within hours of being requested. It was the kind of operation that would require an almost perfect level of coordination, speed, and daring. But it was the only option left if Patton's Third Army was to continue its historic advance. The problem was clear. Orloff needed to get supplies from the beaches of Normandy, through the shattered infrastructure of France, and to Patton's frontline divisions in record time. The American army was now stretched thin, and without the means to support its advance, it would soon come to a halt. The solution, however, was anything but clear. Orloff and his officers would need to think outside the box, come up with a plan that was not just creative but utterly audacious. Every officer in Patton's command was watching the situation unfold. The enemy was closing in, and every moment spent without a solid supply line meant a greater chance of defeat. The Americans had taken the initiative, and now, the weight of the war's future rested on whether or not they could sustain their momentum. Orloff knew that a failure to act quickly would result in catastrophe. The Americans could not afford to stop, not when they were so close to victory, not when Paris was within their reach. But there was one more piece to this puzzle that Orloff could not ignore: manpower. The American military, in its push to liberate France, had been relying heavily on African-American soldiers to fill critical roles, especially in the logistical sections of the army. It was these men, many of whom had been segregated from the rest of the forces, who would soon prove to be the unsung heroes of the operation. Their courage and resilience would become the backbone of the operation that would keep Patton's forces moving. Orloff knew that he would need their help, and more than just a few men. He would need an army of drivers who could keep the supply lines open under the most extreme conditions. But how to organize this effort? How to put this vision into motion when traditional thinking had already failed? These were the questions that Orloff had to answer, and time was running out. The problem was clear, but the solution would require a level of ingenuity, determination, and sacrifice that no one could yet fully comprehend. The next few days would determine whether Patton's Third Army would continue its historic march, or whether the rapid advance of the Allies would grind to a halt under the weight of its own logistical shortcomings. Orloff was determined to make sure the former happened, but the question was, could he succeed where every traditional method had failed? As the sun set over the war-torn French countryside, Orloff knew that his time was running out. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clock was ticking. It was now or never. General Alexander Orloff stood before a chalkboard covered in maps and calculations, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The problem facing Patton's Third Army was clear. Without an efficient and continuous supply chain, the army would be immobilized, and the momentum of the Allied advance would grind to a halt. The road networks through France were in shambles, constantly under threat from German attacks, and the American logistical infrastructure had failed to keep pace with the speed of Patton's forces. The Allies had managed to push far beyond their initial plans, but now they were facing a crisis. They had outrun their ability to resupply. Orloff knew that a solution was needed, and quickly. In his command tent, surrounded by a team of officers and logistics experts, he began to outline a bold plan. A plan that, if executed correctly, could become the lifeline that would keep the army moving. The task at hand was overwhelming. A solution that would require every available resource, every piece of equipment, and every ounce of ingenuity. The operation would need to deliver vast quantities of supplies to the front lines without any delay, and it would need to do so with unprecedented efficiency. What Orloff was about to propose would be the largest and most audacious logistical operation in the history of warfare. After much deliberation, Orloff and his officers came to the same conclusion. They would create the Red Ball Express. It was an operation so daring that, at first, even the most experienced logisticians could not fathom its success. The plan was simple in theory, but almost impossible in practice. The key was the continuous, unbroken transportation of supplies directly from the ports in Normandy to the front lines, with no interruptions. Trucks would run around the clock, 24 hours a day, with only brief stops for fuel and emergency repairs. The entire operation would rely on sheer volume, moving as much material as possible in the shortest amount of time. Orlov knew the risks involved in such an operation. The Germans were still in the area, and they could launch attacks at any moment to disrupt the logistics chain. Moreover, the Allies' supply routes were not secure, with bridges destroyed and roads riddled with craters. The trucks would have to traverse these damaged routes without delay, and any breakdown in the system could lead to catastrophic delays. The men and machines involved would be stretched to their absolute limits. Yet, there was no other option. The only way to keep Patton's forces advancing was to create a system that could deliver supplies faster than the enemy could destroy them. The logistics plan was laid out clearly. The idea was to create multiple one-way routes that would operate in parallel, ensuring that the flow of trucks would never stop. Each route would be designated for specific types of supplies, and the trucks would follow a tight schedule, leaving every 5 minutes. The vehicles would travel at a speed of 35 miles per hour, pushing through the night, maintaining a steady rhythm. This was no longer just a logistical challenge. It was a race against time. Orlov immediately called for an emergency meeting with the leading officers, engineers, and logistics coordinators. They discussed how to ensure the trucks would keep moving despite the constant mechanical failures that would inevitably occur. The trucks, already worn out from the constant movement, would require almost constant maintenance, and every repair had to be done as quickly as possible. Orlov's solution was simple but effective. Mechanics would work around the clock, stationed every 50 miles along the routes, ready to address any issue within minutes. The trucks would be repaired on the move, whenever possible, without losing more than a few minutes of valuable time. If a truck broke down completely, it would be abandoned and a new one would take its place. The drivers would be the backbone of this operation. Orlov knew that the men would have to work in shifts, driving tirelessly through the day and night without rest. It was a grueling task, one that would stretch the limits of human endurance. There would be no breaks, no respite, except for the necessary stops for fuel. The drivers would become the unsung heroes of the operation, their actions keeping the wheels of the American war machine turning. They would carry the supplies that kept the tanks and artillery moving, ensuring that Patton's forces had what they needed to continue their advance. At the same time, Orlov understood that the operation's success depended not only on the drivers and the mechanics, but also on the security of the convoys. The roads, though battered, were still vulnerable to attack. The Germans were masters of disruption, and they would likely target the convoys with everything they had: airstrikes, sabotage, and ambushes. But Orlov's strategy was clear. The trucks would not hide or take evasive action. Instead, they would move forward with absolute confidence, each convoy an unstoppable force. The trucks would operate on a 24-hour schedule, without regard to the risks of enemy action. They would maintain their schedule no matter what. Orlov believed that if the trucks were moved at the speed of war, there would be no time for the Germans to mount an effective defense against them. The sheer audacity of the plan was overwhelming. Trucks would travel the roads day and night, moving in intervals of just 5 minutes. A steady stream of vehicles would churn through the wreckage of French roads, fully loaded, carrying 2,500 tons of supplies each day. There would be no time to spare, no slowing down. The goal was to deliver an unprecedented amount of supplies directly to the front lines, bypassing the traditional system of supply depots and railroads, which had already proven unreliable. The Red Ball Express would operate in the face of every obstacle, outpacing the Germans and defying conventional military doctrine. Orlov's team was skeptical at first. The logistical feat was almost beyond comprehension, and the risks were enormous. But Orlov remained steadfast in his belief. The success of the Third Army depended on this operation, and without it, the Allies would lose their momentum. There was no time to wait for the ideal conditions. The system had to be implemented as quickly as possible, and the trucks had to start rolling immediately. The next step was to gather the men and resources needed to carry out this monumental operation. Orlov knew that manpower would be the key. The Red Ball Express. would rely on a vast number of drivers, mechanics, and support personnel to keep it running smoothly. Most of the drivers, he realized, would come from the ranks of African American soldiers who had been segregated into their own units. These men, who had long been excluded from combat positions, would now play a critical role in ensuring the success of the operation. Their role was essential, as they would be the ones driving the trucks that would bring supplies to the front lines. The operation was more than just a logistical challenge. It was a test of the American military's adaptability, ingenuity, and determination. Orloff and his team would soon discover whether their audacious plan could become a reality. The Red Ball Express was about to be launched, and with it, the future of Patton's Third Army would be determined. The question was no longer whether they could achieve it. It was whether they could sustain it long enough to make a decisive difference in the war. The first week of the Red Ball Express operation began with a series of problems that no one had anticipated, despite the careful planning that had gone into its execution. From the moment the trucks rolled out, it was clear that the magnitude of the operation was taking a toll on every aspect of the system. The drivers, who had been prepared for the grueling task ahead, quickly began to show signs of exhaustion. They had been told they would be driving around the clock, but the relentless pace was draining them faster than anticipated. The mental and physical toll of continuously navigating damaged roads, often under the threat of airstrikes or sabotage, began to manifest in fatigue that no one had truly prepared for. Meanwhile, the trucks themselves, many of which had been pushed to their limits even before the operation began to break down. The wear and tear on the engines, combined with the poor condition of the roads, meant that mechanical failures were a constant issue. What had been designed as a well-oiled machine quickly became a battlefield of its own. The trucks, which were meant to deliver vital supplies with speed and efficiency, now faced constant mechanical breakdowns that threatened to bring the entire operation to a halt. Mechanics, who had been deployed along the routes to keep the convoys moving, were overwhelmed. They were working tirelessly, day and night, attempting to keep the trucks in service. But despite their best efforts, the sheer volume of breakdowns was too much. Parts were in short supply, and each repair seemed to take longer than the last. Mechanics worked without sleep, improvising solutions with whatever they could find, but the system was beginning to creak under the strain. Some trucks, unable to be repaired in time, were abandoned on the side of the road, their cargo unloaded and transferred to other vehicles. The drivers, forced to keep moving despite their fatigue, continued their journey, knowing that any delay would risk the entire operation. The pressure mounted daily as the Red Ball Express grew, and with it, the realization that even the smallest hiccup could have catastrophic consequences. As the trucks continued to move, it became evident that the operation's scale had outgrown the initial calculations. What had seemed like a simple solution to a logistical nightmare had turned into an immense challenge. The roads, which were supposed to facilitate the rapid movement of supplies, were only adding to the problem. Many of them had been destroyed by previous battles, and what remained was often nothing more than a shattered path, barely passable by the massive convoy trucks. Potholes, destroyed bridges, and abandoned vehicles littered the way. Drivers were forced to navigate treacherous terrain, often risking damage to the trucks just to keep up with the relentless schedule. And then, to make matters worse, the Germans began to understand the magnitude of the operation. Early reconnaissance reports had already signaled the strange, continuous movement of vehicles. Endless convoys of American trucks crisscrossing the war-torn French landscape. What the Germans had dismissed as a minor logistical issue quickly evolved into a major threat. They realized that the speed at which supplies were moving could soon become a game-changer. If the Americans could continue at this pace, it would break the back of the German defenses. The Allies could hold their ground, liberate cities, and keep their momentum toward the German border. The Germans responded quickly. They launched a series of attacks to try to halt the convoys. Airstrikes were the first option, with bombers attempting to hit the convoys while they were on the move. But the sheer number of vehicles, their constant movement, and the absence of predictable stopping points made this a difficult task. The bombers, even with their numerical advantage, found it hard to target the moving convoys effectively. German intelligence then shifted focus to sabotage. Saboteurs, working in teams, sought to disrupt key routes by planting explosives, cutting bridges, and ambushing the convoys at key choke points. The goal was simple: disrupt the supply line long enough to slow the American advance. But each attempt to derail the operation only added to the chaos, and the Germans quickly found themselves facing a force they hadn't prepared for. Despite the chaos and mounting obstacles, the Red Ball Express continued to advance. It was not a smooth operation, far from it. There were breakdowns, delays, and constant tension along the routes. But the trucks kept moving. Each convoy that made it through one stretch of road or successfully dodged an airstrike only served to prove that the Red Ball Express was not a failure waiting to happen. It was a living, breathing organism that adapted and pushed forward. The American strategy, which relied on sheer volume and unyielding speed, was starting to prove its worth. The Germans had underestimated the resilience of the operation and its ability to adapt under pressure. The mechanics, for their part, had begun to adjust their approach. Faced with the sheer number of repairs needed, they adopted a more streamlined system of triage, prioritizing the trucks that were still operable and moving those that were beyond repair to the side. They learned how to cannibalize parts from broken vehicles, using spare parts to keep the trucks running. This improvisation, though not ideal, became a necessity. The once fragile system, which had seemed doomed to collapse under the weight of its own scale, began to show signs of stability. The vehicles, though worn down by the constant strain, kept running, thanks to the relentless work of the mechanics and the ingenuity of the drivers. As the days passed, the operation gained momentum. The convoys that had been slow and disjointed in the beginning now ran with greater efficiency. The initial chaotic energy of the Red Ball Express was starting to evolve into a more synchronized, reliable supply chain. More trucks were mobilized, and the reserves of parts and fuel that had seemed so limited at the outset began to stretch further. The speed at which supplies were reaching the front lines was increasing daily. The Germans, for all their attempts to disrupt the operation, were unable to match the scale and determination of the Red Ball Express. What had started as a logistical nightmare for the Allies was turning into a strategic advantage. The flow of supplies became a key element in the rapid advancement of Patton's Third Army. But the strain was still evident. Every convoy, every mile traveled, brought new challenges. The Germans, seeing the effectiveness of the operation, intensified their efforts. They threw everything they had at the convoys, including tanks, artillery, and a full complement of bombers. But despite these attacks, the Red Ball Express pressed on. It was more than just a supply line now. It had become a symbol of the American determination to fight through any obstacle, no matter how large. The Red Ball Express was, in essence, a living testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the American war effort, a force that would continue to roll forward no matter the cost. Each passing day brought new hardships, but it also brought the realization that the impossible was becoming possible. The trucks, though constantly at risk, continued to push through, and with each load delivered, the Germans grew more desperate. They had miscalculated the strength of the Allied logistics and were now paying the price. The supply line that had once seemed doomed was proving to be one of the most potent weapons in the Allied arsenal. The Red Ball Express was working, and it was working against all odds. As the days passed, the immense pressure that had threatened to break the Red Ball Express operation began to ease, and the system started to stabilize. What had initially seemed like an insurmountable challenge, keeping an enormous convoy of trucks moving under relentless pressure, was now starting to function with the necessary speed and efficiency. Despite the ongoing mechanical failures, the shattered roads, and the constant threat of enemy attacks, the trucks continued to roll. The operation was gradually finding its rhythm, and the Allies were beginning to see the fruits of their labor. One of the key factors that allowed the Red Ball Express to find its footing was its ability to adapt quickly to the ever-changing conditions. Roadblocks, which had seemed like a death sentence for the operation, were no longer a stopgap. Instead, new routes were created, bypassing the areas where the enemy had concentrated their efforts to impede the supply line. In some cases, entire sections of the route were rebuilt by engineers in a matter of hours, allowing the convoys to keep moving without significant delays. What had once been an inflexible, broken system was now an adaptable force, able to pivot and change direction whenever the need arose. This ability to adjust quickly was crucial in maintaining the momentum of the operation. The mechanics, who had initially struggled to keep up with the breakdowns, now had a more refined approach to their work. They had learned how to repair trucks more efficiently, sometimes making field repairs on the move, and when necessary, swapping parts from broken vehicles to keep others operational. The trucks, though battered, began to make the round trips with greater reliability. It was a never-ending cycle of maintenance and movement, but it was a cycle that was now sustaining itself. Even in the face of these challenges, the system was starting to yield results. Each convoy that made it through a difficult stretch of road, each truck that returned from a repair with a new lease on life, was another victory in the ongoing battle to keep Patton's army moving. The supply line was no longer a bottleneck. It was a force that was actively propelling the American forces forward. The constant arrival of supplies meant that Patton's troops were no longer at the mercy of the logistical difficulties they had faced earlier. Tanks were refueled, artillery pieces were rearmed, and soldiers received the necessary provisions to continue their fight. The Germans, for all their efforts to disrupt the Red Ball Express, were starting to lose their grip on the situation. Despite their best attempts to destroy the supply lines, through airstrikes, sabotage, and ambushes, the supplies continued to reach the front. With each day that passed, the German forces grew more frustrated. They had believed that they could stop the American advance by crippling the supply chain, but the Americans had outmaneuvered them. The German forces began to lose their initiative. The attacks they launched to disrupt the convoys became less effective. They had underestimated the resilience of the American logistical system. The airstrikes, which had initially seemed like the perfect solution, had little impact on the scale and mobility of the Red Ball Express. Bombers were unable to destroy enough trucks to slow down the operation significantly, and even when they managed to damage a convoy, the sheer number of trucks in operation meant that others were quickly able to replace those that had been lost. Sabotage, too, had limited success. While some trucks were destroyed in ambushes, the overall strategy of quickly repairing and replacing vehicles ensured that the loss of a few trucks didn't slow down the operation for long. The Germans were used to a different kind of warfare, one where supply lines were vulnerable and easily disrupted. The Americans, however, had created a system that relied not on perfection, but on sheer volume and redundancy. For every truck the Germans knocked out of action, 2 more took its place. This redundancy became the key to the success of the Red Ball Express. By the end of the week, the situation had dramatically improved. The convoys were now operating with a level of efficiency that even Orloff had not dared to hope for when the operation had first begun. The trucks were moving faster, the mechanics were repairing vehicles quicker, and the drivers, despite their exhaustion, were beginning to find a rhythm. The operation that had seemed doomed to failure was now becoming a logistical juggernaut, moving supplies at an unprecedented rate. The success of the Red Ball Express had a profound impact on the larger strategic picture. With each successful delivery, Patton's army grew more confident, knowing that their supply lines were secure and that they could continue their advance without the looming threat of logistical collapse. The Germans, meanwhile, began to realize that they were no longer in control of the situation. Their attempts to disrupt the supply lines had failed, and the American forces, buoyed by a reliable flow of resources, were continuing their advance with renewed vigor. What had seemed like an impossible task, the continuous supply of an advancing army, was now a reality. The Red Ball Express, a system born of necessity, had become the backbone of the American offensive in Western Europe. It was the engine that powered Patton's rapid advance, allowing him to keep the Germans off balance and in retreat. The constant resupply of his forces gave him the flexibility to maneuver and strike at the heart of the German defense, turning the tide of the war in the Allies' favor. With each passing day, the operation became more entrenched in the rhythm of the war. What had started as a desperate gamble, an attempt to keep the Third Army moving despite the odds, had evolved into a crucial element of the Allied strategy. The Red Ball Express was no longer just a supply line. It had become a symbol of American ingenuity, determination, and adaptability. In a war defined by technological innovation and tactical brilliance, the success of the Red Ball Express was a reminder that, in the end, it was often the simplest ideas, those rooted in raw determination, that could tip the scales in favor of victory. By the end of the week, the Germans had essentially conceded that they could not stop the flow of supplies to Patton's army. They had thrown everything they had at the Red Ball Express, and yet the supplies kept coming. With every load of fuel, ammunition, and rations delivered, the Allied forces moved closer to their final goal: the defeat of the German war machine. The Red Ball Express had proven that, in modern warfare, logistics was not just a support mechanism, it was the backbone of victory. 72 hours after the operation had begun, the situation at the front lines began to stabilize. The relentless pace of the Red Ball Express had overcome the earlier mechanical failures, roadblocks, and German attempts at sabotage. The convoys, which had once seemed doomed to fail under the strain, were now operating at full capacity. Supplies, fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies were now flowing steadily to the American forces, keeping Patton's Third Army moving forward without interruption. What had once been a logistical nightmare had transformed into a lifeline, allowing the Allies to keep their momentum and press forward against a German defense that was now crumbling. Patton, upon receiving the first reliable supply shipments, felt a surge of confidence. His forces were no longer vulnerable to the same logistical difficulties that had stalled their previous advances. With the assurance that supplies would continue to arrive, the momentum of his army was unstoppable. The once inconveniently distant resources were now just a part of the well-oiled machine of warfare. Tanks were fueled, artillery was reloaded, and soldiers could carry on without the looming fear of being cut off from essential supplies. The success of the Red Ball Express was not just a logistical victory, it was a strategic game-changer. The German forces, realizing that their defenses were being overrun at a pace they couldn't sustain, began to withdraw. The relentless advance of Patton's Third Army was bolstered not only by the fighting power of its soldiers, but by a steady supply of everything they needed to fight. The realization that their positions were increasingly untenable had set in among the German ranks. The Germans had been counting on a breakdown in American logistics to halt their progress. But instead, the Allies had found a way to keep their army fueled and supplied faster than they could destroy it. The German defense, once a significant barrier, now seemed fragile in the face of the supply chain that kept pushing the Allies forward. The speed of the Red Ball Express and its ability to adapt to the challenges of war were now being recognized as one of the key reasons for the success of the Allies' push across France. What had initially been seen as a logistical necessity had, in a matter of days, become a core part of the Allied strategy, propelling them toward their ultimate goal of liberating Europe. Paris, the heart of the French resistance, was now within reach. With a consistent flow of supplies, Patton's forces could continue their relentless advance, liberating city after city and pushing the Germans ever closer to their own border. For the officers and soldiers who had endured the early days of the operation, the realization of how essential the Red Ball Express had been was overwhelming. The operation had taken a toll on everyone involved, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The drivers, mechanics, and logisticians had worked beyond exhaustion to make the operation work. Every mile covered was a victory in itself. Every convoy that made it to the front lines meant more fuel, more ammunition, more hope for a quick victory. For them, the success of the Red Ball Express was not just a strategic advantage. It was the lifeblood of the operation, the thing that allowed them to continue fighting. The Red Ball Express was more than just a logistical solution. It had become a symbol of the Allied ability to adapt, innovate, and overcome adversity. The sheer scale of the operation, the audacity of its implementation, and the determination of the men who carried it out would forever change how military logistics were viewed in the future. What had started as a desperate solution to a critical problem had evolved into one of the most efficient and daring logistical operations in history. As Patton's forces closed in on Paris, the success of the Red Ball Express became clear. The Germans, though still determined, no longer had the resources to mount a defense. Their supply lines had been stretched thin. Their ability to resupply their forces had faltered. The Allies, on the other hand, were equipped with a steady stream of supplies that allowed them to maintain pressure on the Germans without pause. The Red Ball Express had effectively turned the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. By the time Paris was liberated and the American forces had broken through to the German border, the importance of logistics had been firmly established as a cornerstone of modern warfare. Analysts in the years following the war would look back at the Red Ball Express as a defining moment in military logistics. The operation had proven that, in modern warfare, a continuous and reliable supply chain could be as decisive as any battle fought on the front lines. The ability to keep an army supplied, moving, and fueled was not just a matter of support. It was a matter of victory. Military historians and strategists would later agree that the success of the Red Ball Express was not just a fluke or a temporary solution to a problem. It was a game-changing operation that demonstrated the power of speed, volume, and adaptation in the face of overwhelming odds. The lessons learned from the operation would inform military strategy and logistics for years to come, not just for the Americans, but for the world. The success of the Red Ball Express went beyond just the immediate impact it had on the war. It had changed the way logistics were viewed in military planning. The operation had shown that in a fast-moving, mechanized war, the side that could move the most supplies the quickest, the most efficiently, and with the least amount of disruption could win. The Red Ball Express had made that a reality. What was once seen as a cumbersome and slow process, getting supplies to the front lines, had been revolutionized, and the speed and efficiency of that system had helped bring about the liberation of Paris and, ultimately, the end of the war in Europe. For the men who had been a part of it, the Red Ball Express was more than just an operation. It was a testament to their perseverance and ingenuity in the face of incredible challenges. The soldiers who had driven the trucks, who had maintained the convoys, who had risked their lives to keep the supplies moving. These men had played a pivotal role in the success of the Allies. They were the unsung heroes of the war, the ones who had kept the wheels of victory turning when it seemed like everything might come to a halt. And when the war finally ended in Europe, the Red Ball Express stood as one of the most impressive logistical triumphs in history, a symbol of what could be achieved when innovation, determination, and industry came together in the heat of battle. Without it, the Allied forces would have struggled to maintain their advance, and the war might have dragged on for much longer. But with the success of the Red Ball Express, the path to victory had been cleared, and the Allies had been able to finish the job they had started. General Orloff stood before a map in his tent, surrounded by his colleagues. The long, grueling weeks of planning, improvising, and overcoming immense obstacles had led them to this moment. The Red Ball Express had, against all odds, become the lifeblood of Patton's Third Army, enabling their rapid advance across France. What had started as a logistical nightmare, a problem that seemed too large and too complicated to solve, had been transformed into one of the most audacious and successful operations of the war. Orloff reflected on how far they had come, how close they had come to failure, and how, despite the overwhelming challenges, they had succeeded. He was standing not just in front of a map, but in front of a new paradigm in warfare. The operation, Orloff realized, had not just been about delivering supplies to the front lines. It had been a lesson in the critical role that logistics played in the success of an army. The Red Ball Express was more than a supply line. It was a symbol of the modern approach to warfare, where success depended not just on firepower and strategic genius, but also on the ability to adapt quickly, innovate, and use all available resources in the most efficient way possible. The sheer scale of the operation, the adaptability, the speed at which they had learned to operate under constant pressure, proved that logistics was no longer a secondary concern in warfare. It was, as they had shown, central to military strategy. Orlov had always understood the importance of logistics, but the success of the Red Ball Express had driven the point home in a way no textbook could ever explain. In the past, logistics were often seen as an afterthought in military planning, something that simply needed to be managed. But in modern warfare, especially in a conflict as large as World War II, the ability to maintain a supply line could make the difference between success and failure. The Red Ball Express had proved that logistics could become the strategic backbone of a military campaign. Without it, Patton's Third Army would have been crippled, unable to continue its advance. The success of the operation was a demonstration that in the fast-moving, ever-changing theater of modern warfare, it was not enough to simply win battles. The ability to maintain the fight, to supply and sustain forces under intense pressure, was equally crucial. The Red Ball Express had also changed the way military leaders would view the importance of adaptability and resourcefulness. Orlov and his team had not relied solely on established doctrines or the standard methods of supply. Instead, they had embraced a solution that was unconventional, fast, and relentless. They had had to think on their feet, reacting to roadblocks, mechanical failures, sabotage, and even enemy attacks, all while trying to maintain the smooth flow of supplies. Their ability to adapt to each new problem that arose was what ultimately led to the success of the operation. In a sense, they had built the operation not from traditional military doctrine, but from the lessons learned along the way. The operation was, therefore, a reflection of the Allies' ability to innovate, to improvise, and to push the limits of what was possible under the most demanding conditions. Orlov knew that this was the lesson that would resonate most in the years to come. The Red Ball Express was not just about the supply line itself. It was about the strategic shift it represented. As future wars unfolded, the ability to adapt, to build a resilient and flexible supply network, and to maintain that network despite constant pressure would be seen as a crucial factor in success. The operation had proven that the speed at which supplies could be moved, replenished, and delivered directly to the front lines was just as important as the strategies employed on the battlefield. Without the Red Ball Express, Patton's forces would have faltered, and their momentum would have stalled. Paris, perhaps, would not have been liberated as swiftly as it had been. The German forces would have had more time to regroup, and the Allies might have been forced into a prolonged war of attrition. The success of the Red Ball Express had allowed Patton to maintain his speed, to keep pressure on the German lines, and to advance with unprecedented swiftness. It had enabled the Third Army to break through, to move from city to city with remarkable efficiency, and to strike fear into the heart of the German command. The operation had provided an invaluable lesson for future military campaigns. The ability to adapt, to sustain an army's logistical needs under pressure, and to use that infrastructure as a weapon in itself could change the course of an entire conflict. Patton's victory was not just a matter of superior tactics or superior firepower. It was a victory made possible by the relentless and effective logistical backbone that supported it. In the years following the war, military analysts would look back at the Red Ball Express as one of the key turning points of the conflict. It would be studied as an example of how modern warfare required not only superior battlefield tactics, but a far-reaching, adaptable, and efficient logistics system. It was a game-changer in how wars would be fought in the future. And for Orlov and the men who had worked tirelessly to make it a reality, the Red Ball Express would remain a symbol of what could be achieved when traditional thinking was abandoned in favor of a bold, innovative approach to warfare. As Orlov looked back on the success of the operation, he realized that its impact had gone far beyond just the immediate military victories. It had fundamentally changed the way war was fought and would continue to be fought in the future. The Allies had proven that in modern warfare, it was not just about who had the most tanks or the best air force. It was about who could supply their forces most efficiently and keep them moving forward, even under the most difficult circumstances. In this, the Red Ball Express had become the epitome of modern military strategy. The success of the operation had also proven something else, That the men who drove the trucks, repaired the vehicles, and kept the convoys moving were just as important as the soldiers on the front lines. They were the unsung heroes of the campaign, whose hard work and determination kept the entire war effort moving forward. The operation had shown that victory depended not just on the power of arms, but on the collective will to adapt and sustain in the face of overwhelming challenges. Without their efforts, without the ingenuity and perseverance of every man involved in the Red Ball Express, the war would have turned out very differently. In the end, the Red Ball Express had shown that logistics was not merely a support role in modern warfare. It was the deciding factor in the outcome of the war itself. And in that moment of reflection, Orlov knew that they had not only won the war on the battlefield, but had redefined how wars would be fought for generations to come.